My name's Kelly Cook. I'm going to do a tutorial on how to make simple owls from old book pages today. Let me show you some of my favorite resources to start with. I am a junkie for old books, especially ones that are already waterlogged and damaged and falling apart. And so this is one of my favorites of all time. It's called Danger Is My Business. I love this book, and it's also already falling apart. And when you use old books, it gives you automatic texture and background and kind of something to play with and work with. I also love shiny watercolors that you can find for about $5 or $8 at Michael's. I have an old gross $5 packet of watercolors as well. And then for references for any animals that you want to do on old book pages, then I love these books right here. 20 Ways to Draw a Tree, 20 Ways to Draw a Cat. There are several different ideas in there for many different animals for you to look at. I draw owls a little bit differently than the ones that are found in these book pages, but I also love to, you can draw right in the book pages, you can find lots of references, simple line drawings to build off of. They're brilliant, so I love those very much. Probably my favorite and most necessary material for doing the owls on these would be Prismacolors. They're ridiculously expensive, but totally worth it. They can wear out kind of fast as well, but I like it when they get very old and bleedy, and so that they are naturally shading. I have a giant pack of Prismacolor colored pencils. Some things you can buy cheaply. I actually think acrylic paints are something that I often buy cheaply. And I like the $2, $3 Apple Barrel acrylic paints because they're already watered down for projects like this, and water on old book pages does not go well. But I do think that you need expensive colored pencils if you're going to use those, and then just a normal pencil as well. So let's get started. I'm going to take from this book page, I usually use an X-Acto knife, but this one is actually so brittle and old, it's just falling apart. So I rip it right out like this. Again, I love this sheet. It says, How Danger Became My Business. And so it's just a really neat sheet. It already is absolutely crumbling though, so be aware of that, that your sheet could crumble easily. All right, so if we're going to make a simple owl, the first thing we need to do is to make an oval. As easy as that. So we make an oval. Okay. And then we need to make the horns of our owl, the horn feathers of our owl. So we make a big curvy V. Big curvy V right inside. Oval curvy V. Next, our eyes go on the outside of the owl, and I definitely did not invent this, but I have loved seeing big and small eyes to give them a little bit more character. And then you can draw in, if you want to just be very simple, little teardrop feathers that are going to work for the outside as the wings. There are all sorts of variations you can already make on this, and I'm totally giving you permission and happy for you to steal exactly how my owl design works, even though I believe very much in giving credit to artists and buying their work. I also know that sometimes you have to start somewhere with designs, and so this is one you are welcome to just straight up rip off and start to create owls and then learn how to maybe make it into your own. So with this, I have made little teardrop feathers just down the side. I have little oval toes, and then I did draw in quickly a little branch for my owl to be standing on. So right now, I have the basics of my owl. Okay, so now this is when we start to change it up and get a bit more creative with how we're going to execute our owl. Okay, I'm going to start with some watercolors. And again, I know a lot of people have their preferences on what's expensive and what's inexpensive. For me, I don't mind my watercolors being inexpensive. Part of it might be because I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. They love to create things with me whenever I can get them off of video games. And so having the ability to bring them in and not worry too much about my expensive supplies has been a gift. The trickiest thing about old paper is going to be that it's exactly that, old paper. Unlike watercolor paper, this does not hold water well. You have to do very small amounts of water on it, if any, and we're not going to watercolor like you might on a watercolor sheet where you first put the water in and then you bleed the paint in. We're actually going to do this much more directly. I took my water bowl and I wet my paints a little bit. So I'm going to take those direct, and I want to also have a palette. There's another thing that's important to note. You can have it rainbow and all over the place, that's fine, but you do want to pick your palette. I've picked peaches, yellows, and pinks for this particular owl. Now I'm going to just do a dot of color in a few of the feathers on the wings. And I'll start with that peachy color. Now it's a little bit difficult to see, and I'm sorry I can't hold it upright because watercolor will drip. But now that I have done that, something that's really important is that the water is going to soak into the page. It could bleed a little bit. These you have to be a little bit just more fun with and more carefree about. But do realize that if you get too much water on that page, it's just going to blister it and it's going to be totally ruined. I'm going to pick my second amount of pink colors. And I'm going to fill in those feathers. Now if I want to stay within the pink theme, that's fine. But I like going just a little bit further over on the color wheel, and I'm going to blend together some yellow and some peach because that's going to give my little owl some more depth into those feathers, and then those are just beads or drops of water right on there. I already have some of them blending together. It's totally appropriate when you're not doing a video tutorial and worried that your battery's going to run out on your iPhone while you're filming it, that you would take your time in between those, let them dry completely. All right, so now I have, with several different colors, my feathers filled in for this owl. Probably the most technical part I'm going to do at this point, I want to have a blend of colors up in my owl's head. So I'm going to start with my darkest shade over here in order to give him a little, or her, a little bit of depth. My son Augie, who's 10, loves pink the most, so I can say him just fine. So I have the dark color over here. Now I'm actually going to rinse my brush off, but notice I'm going to dry it off because I do not want too much water on this paper. If I do that, and I have done it many times, it'll ruin it, and maybe you can shred it up and make it into a collage or something, but it won't hold the paint very well, and it will be too wrinkly, and when it looks wrinkly, it just looks cheap and sloppy. I'm blending those in the head just a little bit for my little guy, and now I have a blended color up top. Once again, if you're not doing something quickly on a video, not a bad idea to allow this to dry completely in between layers. Next, I'm going to get to the black, and once again, unlike normal watercolor technique, I am not going to first wet the paper, but paint directly onto the page. I have a habit, I don't know if it's good or it's bad, but I tend to put my palette together as it goes on the painting itself. I don't usually mix colors ahead of time. If you want to mix colors ahead of time, the good news is you might not mess up a color palette that you don't want. So as I color his eyes in and his toes, you'll notice that I left a little dot so that we see light reflecting on his eyes. And then I'm going to let that dry. Okay, while that owl is drying, we're going to work on a Prismacolor marker owl. Same starter. Start with an oval. This one I'm going to make a little bit fatter. Still the same page that I used before, but I'm going to make this one a little bit more of a fat owl. I'm going to start with the oval again, just like I did, and then I'm going to draw in those same, what are those called? The horns, I know, but they're not really horns. They're just the feathery horns on the owl. Now, some of the things, we're going to make this guy just a little bit more menacing and a little bit tougher. Okay, so his horns are going to be a little bit wider, making it like he's got more of an angry eye. And then I'm going to leave this part of the eye, I'm going to leave some of the bags under his eyes just a little bit, so he's a little bit more serious. I'm also going to turn this guy to the side a little bit. And actually, I'll pull his beak over just a tiny bit there. All right, now I'm going to pick up my Prismacolors, and this guy is going to be blue. I won't pre-draw my feathers. Once you start doing a couple of these, you can just wing it. Aw, that was terrible. It's okay if you turn the video off now. I understand. So I'm going to do some little teardrop for my owls on the side. Switch colors. And again, my Prismacolors, they cost like $2 or $3 each. I like to get big packs of them on Amazon. It brings them down to like $1.50 each, but you have to buy 90 or so at a time. Sometimes they start to run out and fade, and I actually love the look of that. I'm intentionally keeping these markers out rather than putting them back in my stack because I have before put markers back and not been sure which ones I was using as I continue to move on. So I want to keep those out. Okay, now this is where you just got to go at it with confidence. I'm going to do a little bit of shading up here in his head and blend those markers. Now Prismacolors, when you buy them in the pack, they actually do come with blender markers. Those would be like, they look like they're just plain white, but they actually can help to blend. They don't blend great on book pages. Book pages have a really strange property that were not really made to be colored on, but like this old one, you can see that I'm starting to pull some of the color from the text when they actually used to print things on a printing press, and that ink is still in there in that way, and it can pull that out. This can be a good or bad effect. Be aware that oftentimes the book will go with you. The page colors will come with you. And so if you don't want that, usually color lighter with less layers. I like the natural shading that's brought in by actually pulling those over with the blender. So I have now got the top of his head colored as well as the feathers, and the head is pulled down somewhat into a beak shape. Okay, next I'm going to just get a plain black Sharpie. This is some place where if you have a torn sheet in your book from ahead of time, this is a great way to test it. So let's say we have a sheet that is too ripped up to try. I definitely want to see how my Sharpie is going to work on that. Sharpie pens, of all things, are my very favorite. I really love Sharpie pens because they have a nice clean line to them. I'm going to do this one with the blue, and they tend not to bleed into the page. But Sharpies can bleed into the page, and so can other markers. So make sure you know what that looks like before you do it on your final product, because you want to have that control. This Sharpie has a similar thing going on to my Prismacolors. It's kind of starting to wear out, but I like the texture that that creates. And so of course you can use a fresh one if you want to, but I really enjoy the look of the roughness of it. Once again, I'm leaving little spots for the eyes, and actually I don't like these, so I'm going to color those out and come back with a white paint just to emphasize it. I'm going to color in the toes with Sharpie, and then I'm going to bring out the details. Now these are optional, right? You can do details however you want. You cannot Sharpie it around. You can do this all with color. Mine are a little bit more comic and a little bit more illustrative, so I like to do that. So here we have so far our basic owl. I've given him a little tiny mohawk. The next thing to do is to color in the feathers. I often like to do this a little bit fast, and I color in feathers that aren't drawn in there. So notice like this one right here. That one is blank, but it's going to pull in the texture of the rest of the owl as well. So now I'm coloring in these feathers and some of them that aren't there, and maybe skip a few. There's an interesting thing that happens when you don't draw your lines totally around. It gives just a little bit more realistic look and a little bit more texture. So you don't always have to complete your lines. I have on this one, but on another one I'll intentionally not do it so that you can see the difference. And I feel like it almost gives it a little bit more sophistication. Because I wanted this guy to look a little bit tougher, I'm going to draw down his eye circles. Maybe he's just tired. He's had a big, long night out. I'll grab my paint palette, very expensive Ziploc Glad topper for a bowl that I use for my paint palettes, probably because they get so covered in paint and I'm really bad at washing them out. I usually don't like to buy them even if they're just a couple of dollars. So I recycle things into my paint palettes. I've chosen probably very thick brush for the body technique that I'm going to do. I'm just pulling in a little bit of white paint around here. Now, with acrylic paint, again, one of the reasons I really like to use the Apple Barrel cheap paints is because it's already pretty thin. That means it's not going to blister my paper quite so much with all the water in there. I do not add any water whatsoever, and I make sure my brush is very dry. And this is just some random whitening for this guy to give him a little more of a pop. The paper is so yellow from the old book page that giving him a little bit of white gives him a little bit more life and more shape to him. I can also come in here and give some of his little feathers a little white tap. And that brings in more of that color. I'm going to take his eyes magically from dead to alive. And then I'm also just going to tap off my brush a little bit and give him a little bit more right up in his head feathers to match. All right, let's move on to making owls on watercolor paper. I love watercolor paper, and I'm going to use both India ink and watercolor on here to show you the different ways that that happens. It's the exact same owl, and you can do this with any other illustrated animal. Sometimes it's really fun and free to put down the shape of your animal first. All right, so I'm going to use my metallic palette that I got here. Again, these are like $5 or $8. They're really wonderful, and they automatically give this really bright and shiny sheen. It's in no way is it going to come out the way it does on this video, but this is especially great for something that you're looking for a little bit more whimsy, like a nursery. These go over very well. So I'm going to choose some greens and some blues in order to do this. And then I'm going to very lightly with my pencil. Let's make a fat owl. Actually, let's make a family. Let's make a little family of owls. We're going to make much more of a circle than an oval. And we'll make a baby owl. Okay, so I've got circle with another circle. Sorry, hard to see on there. Circle and a circle. I don't want it too dark because the watercolor is going to come through everything. It will show all of the pencil lines underneath, and it's impossible to get rid of it. So I'm doing it very basic guidelines for my owls. I don't want too many circles, so I'm sorry that's harder to see. Once again, let me bring my V's, and maybe we'll have our little buddy kind of looking to the side. Bubble toes for my owls. And a little bit of a branch. I have often felt intimidated by drawing things, especially without a reference, and one of the best things I've heard from an art teacher who I adore, Sarah, who was my art teacher in high school, is that think of everything as a shape. It's not a nose and it's not a hand, it's circles and squares and triangles, and that has helped me a lot. Obviously, these guys are not very realistic, but it does help to think of them merely as shapes rather than beaks and horns and feathers. That helps a lot. Okay, so here I go. I'm going to take some of the blue and some of the turquoise, put some straight down. Now I actually it's hard to see, but I rinsed out my brush with water, and now this is just water. If you're new to watercolor, this is by no means my area of expertise, but we tend to think of watercolor more like a crayon, and we really need to paint with the water. So we're actually using tons of water, and that's how you get those really pretty shapes, those really pretty techniques. Like I'm going out of the lines already, that's no big deal. I'm going to fill this in. The baby owl is going to be just a little bit more darker than the mommy owl. So I have lots and lots of water in my watercolor, and I tell my sons, I'm pulling it towards me. I'm not pushing or smushing my brush. I'm pulling it. One of the things too that distinguishes watercolor, and again, by no means am I an expert at this, but leaving little patches of white is something that gives us a little bit more texture. And when it does dry, it's going to give us a little bit more detail and interest. Okay, now I have to decide who's behind who, and I think obviously the mommy is going to be behind the baby, so I'll erase her inside line and let him be on the outside. And I'm going to do a different kind of a wing this time. I'm going to do a much more illustrative wing. I've got my circle, and now my wing is just going to be a half circle or almost like a baseball within it. Rather than the detailed feathers that we did previously, I'm just going to give almost like a leaf shape to these little wings. Erase the outside. Here's a little pro tip. If you have eraser marks and you don't want to smear your page, use a dry paintbrush to get rid of the eraser chunks that come off when you're erasing something. Many times, probably even today, I have accidentally blended, smeared, smushed, or erased into something that I didn't mean to do, and I try to just make that work with the piece. Also, if you're doing things with your kids, you know that they're going to add their own touch to each piece, and there's just nothing you can do about it sometimes. So you got to make it work with your current piece. Once again, you can't see my palette in a huge way, but this is mostly water. When I want the color to be lighter, I do more water. When I want the color to be darker, I do more paint. Watercolor paper, the more expensive the better. It loves to soak up that water, and it is going to puff up a little bit, but it's going to chill out and lay down for you when you're done. And now I'm going to, let's see, I'm actually going to take a smaller brush. And take this brush. Okay, I'm going to tell you a secret. Usually I would put the brush in my mouth, which I'm realizing since I'm videotaping myself, that would make me look weird. So I'm trying to do it with my fingers. So with my liner, I can line out this owl, and we'll do the thing that we talked about earlier, kind of leaving a little bit of space on the lines. If my paint is wet at all, the India ink will blend right into it. So you do have to make sure that your paint is totally dry or it'll just spread out and you'll probably be dissatisfied with what comes of it. So I definitely want to make sure that this paint is dry before I start India inking things, but it is incredibly fun. Also super useful for hand lettering if you like to do things with hand lettering. Now I can actually see that these are still wet, so I'm going to leave them alone. But this will just give us the basic idea of how we can trace with India ink. So I could also do this with a Sharpie. I can do this with a normal pen. I want to make sure it's something that doesn't bleed and that perhaps I tried before. The eyes are still wet too, but I'm going to line those out when they are done. And so we are going to do a combined technique. We've got the watercolor down on there. Now I'm going to get a little drop of black India ink, and I'm going to line the owls with the India ink. Using a tiny drip of water just to shape my brush. I dry it off with my fingertips, and then I'm going to actually show you this part. So here's my India ink, and I'm kind of rolling my brush out. All those other pieces of paint are dry. I'm rolling my brush out so it's a thin tip. Gently start it right here. And I am going to line this owl. Now, a couple of things. Sometimes it can feel very nerve-wracking to do lines. So if you're shaky, don't forget to breathe. And another tip is just go for it. You can't stall or hesitate or you will get that shaky line. So you just have to do it. You just line them out. Okay. With this guy, I'm going to go ahead and make his big eye totally dark black with my India ink, leaving, again, a little circle. It's kind of my favorite way to make them come alive is give them the reflection of the light in their eye. Lining that out. India ink dries relatively quickly, so think about it as you're pulling the bead of paint with you. You want to get it done kind of all at once to have that same texture of the ink. This watercolor paper takes the ink a lot better than a normal sheet of paper would. but it's a lot more expensive. So practicing with or starting on the book pages is fine. I can see right here that my ink is bleeding a little bit. And so that's just my lesson to myself to remember that I have to let things dry 100%, or the India ink or the other paint are going to bleed. It's one of the tricky parts of painting with watercolors and India ink because they love the water, so they try to follow it. Got my big fat owl toes, and I'm actually just gonna leave those empty this time. I think these owls can be really fun to play with, and if you want to do something like representation of each family member, you can have baby owls and big owls and skinny owls and fat owls. I've done a lot of owls for custom nurseries, and so those can be a really neat family piece. You can also do a collage of papers. So typically I would take something very sturdy like Bristol board. Then I would just use a glue stick and collage down papers. Then you can draw and paint right over the top of those, and then you can have a variety. So with that, I have my India inked owls, and I'm going to draw in my tree branch. Probably, if I wasn't doing this on video, I'd take my time quite a bit more and do a nicer technique. But I want to get these done because it's not my outcome as much as how we're doing it that matters on these guys. But there is something for the little bit more carefree or sloppy illustrative style that you can do. Now you can go into your tree and you can make textures and rings and tree rings. I'm actually just going to water down my India ink. So I didn't even put any more India ink on this. I actually am just dipping it in the water, and there's so much ink left in this brush. It's going to make kind of a grayscaled shadows and the branch. Lots of water in here. Leave a little bit of the white just like the watercolor. I like probably the best is when it gets a little bit of sloppy, and now the lines, for one, it helps calm down my incredibly type A personality. And for another, it reminds me more of 1970s children books illustration style, which is one of my favorites. So there we have our mom and baby owl. Gonna let that dry, and we can keep it as simple as that. You could go back in with pencil, ink, other paints, and draw in textures, feathers, leaves. You could definitely do a background if you wanted to. Our other one that we have is this guy. We're just going to finish him up. And I've already done watercolor there, so I'm actually going to pull my watercolors back out, do a little bit of a brown branch underneath him with the watercolors. Remember that when we're on the book page, we want to respect it and not give it too much water. So we always have a brush that's just in paint. It's relatively dry. You could also do this with colored pencil if you wanted to. The multimedia tends to give you a lot more texture. Sometimes when I'm done with an owl, I'll go back in and I'll give him more texture with a pencil. You've seen how we could do it with the acrylic paint as well. Finish up some of his feathers. And let's go ahead and give a little more definition around his eyes and the spot on his eyes. So that guy can be done. Now I have the choice, of course, if I want to fill in a little bit of the branch as well. Better idea to let this dry all the way, both for the sake of the life of your Sharpie and no bleeding, but that could be all done with that guy. And then last but not least, this little fella is finished and dry with the acrylic paint.